Greetings, class. It is I, your beloved professor. As you saw in my Brightspace post on our announcements page, our house has been stricken with illness. Here I am late Sunday night, aware now that I will not be pulling through to see you in the morning, but I didn't want to not leave you with anything for Monday, especially in light of Arbor Day having been Wednesday, so we didn't meet, and you got that amazing video that I made for you about innovations in money and banking during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And so, while I am under the weather, I did want to at least give you something to be going along with. I apologize, I'm feeling very short of breath. Not going to be my usual self, unfortunately. I'm going to do my best. So I want to go through the chapter that you were reading for this week, which would have been the subject of the lecture tomorrow. But then I want, by the end, to start moving on to talk about what I'm really interested in moving on to, which will be the subject of Wednesday's lecture, in which you know from looking at your syllabus, which I know you all consult religiously, is the subject of next week, that is the French Revolution. And this is a tremendously transformative event. So, transformative on Europe in a way that the American Revolution just isn't. And so I'm going to talk about our reading, which was, I believe, chapter 13, Europe and the World, and then I'll start to touch on the reading, which is technically for next week, but which I wanted to start touching on this week because this is the first time this course is run, and I realized looking at it that, wow, I really left myself 3 hours next week to explain the eruption of the French Revolution, the breakdown of the Ancien Regime, the revolutionary period, the rise of the empire, the complete remaking of Europe under the cataclysm of 20 years of war. I left myself basically 2 lecture periods of 1 hour each to do that. And so I thought, gosh, I can talk more about the rest of the world in the aftermath of that because we need to do that. So I want to just kind of do that Wednesday. So I'm going to preface with that. A little bit of housekeeping before I get started on our final reading from Wisner Hanks. Of course, it's a great resource, especially if you want to source mine it for your papers. Before I do that, grades are up and updated. The quiz for this week is posted and is due Wednesday by midnight, as per usual. On Wednesday, I was going to do this tomorrow, but on Wednesday, if you are there, which I hope you are, our friends at the Mises Institute have something for you right here. This is a collection of Hayek's essays on political economy, Hayek for the 21st century. It's got some of his absolute classics in here. The intellectuals in socialism, the use of knowledge in society, choice in currency, all sorts of great stuff that those of you, especially those of you who have had me multiple times, which I know some of you have had me 3 or 4 times now throughout your time at the university, you know that I've talked about these topics to no end, and thanks to our friends at the Mises Institute, now you will have a copy for yourself and for your burgeoning library. So, thank you to our friends at the Mises Institute, and I look forward to seeing you Wednesday to hand these out, and I'll of course spend a few minutes. I can't go crazy on it, like I said. The French Revolution is going to be too important for us not to really fully understand, but we will spend at least a few minutes talking about this. Okay. And maybe I'll make some sort of extra credit assignment around that. So, all right. for now, yes, it was chapter 13. It was chapter 13. Europe and the World, 1600 to 1789. So it is a rather long stretch, right? 2 centuries. When we last left off, of course, we were speaking primarily of the contest between the Spanish and Portuguese on the one hand, and how the Pope, as sort of an international broker, had drawn the line with the Treaty of Tordesillas and said, hey, listen, the Spanish will have everything to the west of that line, the Portuguese will have everything to the east of the line, and this is in part why, number one, why they speak Portuguese in Brazil to this day, also why it was the Portuguese who started diverting a lot of their resources, you're looking at me this way actually, I see now, instead of going to the Americas, to going around the Horn of Africa into the Indian Ocean. That's why the initial contact that most of the Indian Ocean traders have, whether it be Ceylon, the Chinese, it's going to be with the Portuguese. As you see in this chapter, which was your chapter that you read for this week, or that you are in the process of reading for this week, I know it was slightly longer than average. It was about 6 pages longer than the average chapter, but you saw that it was the Portuguese, and eventually they were overtaken by the Dutch, and that the Dutch and the VOC, they had a tremendous amount of success there, at one point monopolizing the spice trade, really in about the 1680s, 1690s. But if you remember, this was right around the time that England was fighting its Dutch wars, defeating the Dutch, permanently weakening them, and so the Dutch rise there is temporary, but that is what's going on there. As you saw in this chapter, but after a couple of pages, she's not really talking anymore about the Spanish, or really about the Portuguese, except when she needs to reference, remember, back in those earlier chapters when we were talking about this, increasingly, who is she talking about? She's talking about the Dutch, she's talking about the English, she's talking about the French, talking about the Russians to some degree, although as we can see, a lot of that was more about overland exploration into the Arctic Circle and across the Bering Strait and whatnot. But, so, European ventures throughout the world in the 17th and 18th centuries were similar in many ways to those in the 16th century that were traced in Chapter 7, but they involved new themes and players. Explorers continued to search for routes from Europe to Asia, but also gathered scientific information and pushed further into the interiors of North and South America. Rulers, for their part, continued to support exploration and colonization, but private companies became more important, providing financial backing, ships, and personnel. In some places, these private companies became actual territorial rulers, working with or displacing indigenous authorities. Colonies continued to provide wealth to monarchs and private investors through the extraction of natural resources, such as precious metals and furs, but plantations of tropical crops using enslaved or other types of forced labor systems became the most significant engines of wealth. The European presence in some parts of the world remained limited to small, isolated trading spots, but in others, large numbers of Europeans and their descendants came to vastly outnumber indigenous peoples in patterns of settler colonialism. This is from the second paragraph on page 519, and even though it's not one of the first bit of the chapter, not one of the first paragraphs, I really feel like that's a great summary of all the important themes that we're going to want to be keeping an eye out for as we are reading this chapter. For the first part, bear in mind, a lot of similarities. The map of the world that these men, primarily men, have in their heads is not the one that we have today. They are still tracing the contours of the continents. They are still trying to find all the islands. They're still searching for all of the continents. They believe, for various reasons, that, look, we're finding all of these continents that are in the northern hemisphere. Naturally, there must be an equivalent amount in the southern hemisphere to balance it out, and so they're exploring the South Pacific, looking for a continent. And of course, they find Australia. Themes. They're searching for wealth. Of course, there are those who are interested in science, it's difficult to say to what extent exploration drove the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment drove exploration. And I say that with a caveat here, because of course exploration was primarily trade driven. It was the search for profit and markets. Power. But as you see in this chapter, and she mentions it at 3 points as I recall, it's this notion that our knowledge is incomplete. It shakes the confidence of the European intellectual world. Example, there was a well-known logical expression about swans being white, right? And that all swans were white. And when they get to Australia, they find a black swan, which swans are white. What is a swan? It's a big white bird. If you see a big white bird that fits this description, what is a swan? And then they go to Australia, they arrive in Australia, and they find black swans. And that's where the term black swan event comes from. It's this sort of out of left field, like maybe it's theoretically possible that this could happen, but it's just flies in the face of all of our experience. No one has ever seen a black swan. No one's ever heard of one. No one's ever recorded one. Boom, black swan. And so they become very obsessed, the European intellectual community, with categorizing and typifying all of the different plant species and animal types. And so that's really a new theme. The new players, we talked about it, the Dutch, the English, the French, really from the late 17th century through the 18th century and into the early 19th century with the final defeat of Napoleon, you can kind of see this period as a battle for European supremacy between the English and the French. I'm not saying that's the only way to view it, but as you recall from our previous lectures, there had been a fear, going all the way back to the beginning of our period, of Habsburg domination of the continent. Remember, they had Spain, they had Austria, they had the Holy Roman Empire, they had the Dutch provinces, they had Italian holdings, islands. Then they had all the gold and things coming in from the Americas, they had the Philippines. And Louis XIV's reign, which occurred at the end of the period that I just indicated, featured a series of wars in which, by this time, Habsburg power has been broken. Really, you can kind of see the breaking of that as occurring during the 30 Years' War, the final breaking of that occurring during the 30 Years' War. But you have France trying to emerge as hegemon. And now, instead of balancing coalitions of other powers against the Habsburgs, now you see balancing powers forming against the French, with the British very often playing a coordinating role and a financial role as a backer. Well, that's going to continue throughout the century. And it's going to, as I said, culminate with the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars and the final defeat of Napoleon and of France. And this ushers in really the British century, if you want to call it. If the 20th century was the American century, then the 19th century was the British century, basically until 1900, 1914, which is where our course, oddly enough, stops. So we really want to understand the origins of the British century. Explorers searching for new routes. Again, to Asia, this is when they're looking for the Northwest Passage. You all remember hearing about that in your high school class on world history. Gathering scientific information. Pushing further into the interiors of North and South America. And this is critical because, yes, of course, by this point, they have mapped, however approximately, the contours of the continents, the rough distances between the shores of the continents. But the interior of a place like South America, a place like North America, a place like Canada, a place like Africa, to these Europeans, these are blank spaces on the map. These are entirely blank spaces on the map. Right up to the end of the period, 1789. These are completely blank spaces of the map. And while I didn't assign this chapter to you, if you read chapter 1, apologies. Chapter 1 of The Age of Revolution, The World in the 1870s, you will find this, which I believe is very apropos of what we're speaking to here. The first thing to observe about the world of the 1780s is that it was at once much smaller and much larger than ours. It was smaller geographically because even the best educated and best informed men then living knew only patches of the inhabited globe. Much of the surface of the oceans, though by no means all, had been explored and mapped, though human knowledge of the seabed was of course to remain negligible until the mid-20th century. The main outlines of the continents and most islands were known, though not too accurately. The size and heights of mountain ranges in Europe were known with some approach to precision. Those in Latin America roughly, those in Asia hardly at all, and those in Africa, with the exception of the Atlas, for practical purposes, not at all. The course of the great rivers was mysterious to all but a handful of traders. Much of the interior of the continent were white spaces, vast. Yet, if the world was in many respects smaller, the sheer difficulty or uncertainty of communications made it in practice much vaster. I do not wish to exaggerate these difficulties. The later 18th century was, by medieval or 16th century standards, an age of abundant and speedy communications, and even before the revolution of the railways. Improvements in roads, horse-drawn vehicles, and postal services are quite remarkable. Between the 1760s and the end of the century, the journey from London to Glasgow was shortened from 10 to 12 days to 62 hours. However, despite all of this, most people did not live much beyond their local parish. So when we're talking about this incredible discovery, we're talking about a very small fraction of the European population that is going out and doing this exploration. 99.9% of people are living and dying within walking distance of where they were born. I have notes on this in this chapter, actually, because I had kind of circled this to highlight. This is on 521. Russian fur traders and whalers were exploring the far north, traveling into the vast areas of Siberia all the way to what is now Alaska in search of fox and sable. These are furs, very marketable. Again, we have the desire for economic profit driving exploration here. Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar, sponsored the Danish captain Vitus Bering on several explorations, and that's where the Bering Strait takes its name from. That's that very narrow bit of water there between Alaska and Russia. But I just circled that to note that, look, just like Columbus, right? This Genoese guy going to work for the Spanish crown. Nationalism doesn't really exist. Nationalism is a product of the French Revolution. It is very much a 19th century phenomenon, and we'll have occasion to talk much more about that. Those of you who looked at your syllabus know there's a whole week devoted to understanding 19th century nationalism. its varieties, and we actually trace it all the way, pretty much, to the present. So it was not weird for a Dane to be working for a Russian any more than it was for a Genoese to be working for a Spaniard. These terms didn't really mean anything. You were from your local place. You were of your city. It was no stranger for a Neapolitan to go and work for a Pisan than it was to go and work for a Castilian. It was incredibly local. The idea of like Italians or Spaniards or Frenchmen, these are not labels that are recognized here. You might be able to make a case that English as a national identity was forming, but even there it's rather complicated because you have these other clear groups that are being merged together. But rulers, while continuing to support exploration and colonization, look, these are very capital-intensive projects, and what rulers are increasingly doing is they are selling the right to do this to private companies. More and more, this is being done by private companies. This is specifically true with joint stock companies, which we talked about. That, look, if you have maybe you have 100,000 pounds or florins or francs or whatever they are. Maybe you have $100,000, let's say, and you could sponsor a voyage to one of these spice islands. And if it makes it back, you're going to make like 6,000% profit or something like that. It's just going to be crazy. But there's probably a 50% chance that you're never going to see that money again because your ship's going to get captured or sunk, or you're just never going to know what happened to it. The ship left and never came back, and you just don't know what happened. That's too big of a risk. What we need is a way to share the risk out, and this is where joint stock companies came in handy. It allowed for the selling of shares, especially ones that could be marketed to the average person. And this is something that we talked about, or that I mentioned in the video about innovations in money and banking, is all of a sudden you could have a person put their savings not in a bank, just some local shop owner or tavern owner. They're not going to put their money in a bank now. Now they're going to put their money in a stock market, basically, a developing stock market, into a joint stock company where instead of interest from a bank, they're going to receive a dividend payment from a company. So trade driving innovation there. In some places, these private companies become the actual territorial rulers. Yes, this is going to happen in India. Which, I'm so sorry. This is going to happen in India. You see this in this chapter, actually. And it's a very brief treatment, obviously. And, the story of Robert Clive and the British East India Company and how they came to effectively govern large parts of India is, I would remind you, tied into the fact that what you had was an essentially very weak central government and also a foreign government. Remember, this had been a dynasty that had been imposed, right? The Mughals were not native to the Indian subcontinent. They were invaders from Central Asia, and this is something that I had mentioned in a lecture previously, which is that, yes, it's just kind of strange that right at this time that Europe is really, at this point, gaining the ascendancy around the globe, or in the process of doing it, and they encounter these other great ancient civilizations and state powers. I'm not here talking about the Americas, because they're in the Americas, as we saw, there were a lot of imbalances, power imbalances. Number one, there was no there was no immunity to diseases that people on the Eurasian continent all had pretty much immunity to. There was also a mismatch in technology, not just gunpowder weapons, which of course the Europeans had, but the Amerindians didn't have. More important, really, stuff like steel. We talked about that, right? If I have a steel sword and a steel breastplate, and you have a bronze sword, you're in huge trouble, because my sword can cut your sword in half, and your sword can't pierce my breastplate. So, but now the Europeans are going to be encountering like the Chinese Empire, the Indian Empire, but it's foreign imposed ruling classes ruling over native populations. And so it's rather the possibility exists for these traders who show up to play local factions off against each other in the case of India, because there's all sorts of different. India is a very complicated example, and if you're that interested in it, then take 331 with me in the summer, because we spend several weeks doing the history of India, and we also do the history of China and the history of Japan. But they're not only able to play the different rulers and factions off against each other, they're also able to play them off against the foreign dynasty. In the case of China, which really is more of a 19th century issue, the opening of China is in the 19th century. So beyond our period for this week, that's going to be something we cover in future weeks. They're going to, the dynasty is going to face a problem. As they're trying to repel these quite advanced, by this point, Europeans, their difficulties in doing this are going to be compounded by the fact that the majority population who don't actually want to be ruled by them, the Han ethnic majority, are going to be periodically revolting against them, trying to throw off the Qing. Oh, I'm so sorry. Trying to throw off the Qing, who are northern Manchus. So we will get to that all in good time. But it's just kind of one of those coincident intersections of history here. Sorry, give me just a second here. I wish I had done this a little bit earlier in the day when I wasn't feeling quite as bad, but I was holding out because I thought, you know what, maybe I just ate something a little funny, no problem, you know, I don't know, feeling a little not so well, but I'll feel better as the day goes on. No, by the time I realized that all the kids were sick, my wife is sick, I'm clearly getting sick, it was too late. So, the colonies were continuing to provide wealth to monarchs and private investors, but it's not going to be through the extraction of natural resources anymore. If you think about it, it's been about 150 years. The mines and the gemstones and stuff like that's, just think about it, that's all pretty much exhausted by this point. There will be a major silver find in central Mexico, but really the big driver of wealth at this point isn't being able to pull metal out of the ground. It's being able to generate cash crops that the growing consumer market in Europe wants. This is what's critical. We've talked about how transformations in European society were creating a growing consumer class. It's too early to talk about like a middle class or something like that, but more and more people are having money in their pocket, cash money, coin, and they're looking to go out and spend this on manufacturers, on consumer goods, on new additions to their diet. And so things like sugar for example, from the Caribbean islands, production of which was very horrifying, was really going to drive production. You don't produce something that no one wants. It was market demand for these things, these products, things like molasses and sugar, that drives this activity. So, of course, this required forced labor systems. We talked about how the native populations were decimated within a few generations. I mean, there's just not enough of them, and they knew the terrain better. They could, you know, vanish into the vast tracts of the forest. You know, you were never going to find them. And so it's just this is where the triangle trade, the transatlantic slave trade comes from. Is there is a need for labor in these places, and what you have is you have raw goods. Let's see, you're looking at me like this. So Europe is over here. You've got, well, let's start over here. In the Caribbean and the Americas, you have raw goods, everything from fish and timber and sugar and molasses, and that's going over to Europe. These are the inputs that they're going to manufacture into other things, other finished goods, to sell to the domestic market mostly. They're then going to load up the ships with finished products like guns, swords, different things like that, compasses, watches, whatever. Send that down here to Africa. Then they're going to trade those to the African chieftains and other people for slaves, and then they're going to send them back across the Atlantic to trade them to sell them. They would sell. It wasn't like barter. It was, you know, a cash economy by this point. To sell them for sugar and molasses and all that stuff in Triangle. You all remember that, I hope, from if you didn't take 121 or 122 with me, at least from your world history class. And then lastly, so this is all from that one paragraph. So I'm just trying to flesh out everything that you are going to, that you either already read or are reading right now here, and showing how this fits. The European presence in some parts of the world remained limited to small, isolated trading outposts. Remember, like the Portuguese, they were setting up shop on little islands, like off the coast of China, off the coast of Japan, off the coast of India. But in other areas, large numbers of Europeans and their descendants came to vastly outnumber indigenous peoples and created different patterns of settler colonialism. So, we talked about this in our previous lecture, which was about chapter 7, about how this idea that geography, how circumstance created different patterns of settler colonialism. How in areas where the soil was, you know, poorer, rockier, where the climate was colder, you tended to see the settlement and growth of small family unit farms and communities, especially from places like England and the Dutch provinces, and places like Massachusetts. Whereas in places like Canada, where it was too cold, couldn't farm, you tended to have a lot of just single men who were just trying to grab furs, because furs are small and portable. You can put a lot of them on a sled. They're not going to go bad like crops. And, you know, over the course of a season, you can grab, you know, several hundred furs, cart those back on your sled, and then, you know, sell those. The family farm, that's mostly subsistence farming, maybe doing a little bit of putting out work. We talked about that in the context of the growth of the industrial economy. Whereas in more in areas where there was really rich soil, where there were large tracts of rich, fertile land, especially in tropical zones, what you tended to have were sprawling plantations that weren't devoted to subsistence agriculture, but were devoted to monoculture. that is specifically the creation of a single cash crop for export to the world market. And we talked too about how disease made this a pretty unattractive place to try and bring a family. And so it led to a lot of ambitious young men who, maybe they didn't see good prospects for themselves in Europe. Maybe they were the second or third son of a nobleman, so they had no chance of inheriting anything because of the entail that kept properties together. They'd go make their fortune in the colonies. And they'd set up these large, plantations, which had, a very small number of European settlers, large amounts of forced labor, and then a much blurred racial hierarchy, because there were no women there. So they tended to marry into local women. And we talked all about that in the context of chapter 7. So, and we talked about that creolization. And I mentioned that great book by Simon, which is on one of these shelves. I don't know, it's on one of these shelves somewhere, but it's The Ideology of Creole Revolution, which is a good book. I recommend it. 522, they talk specifically on 522 about how the discovery of all these new places, and finding all these different plants and animals, and they started carrying scientists and botanists and people with them so that they could document what they saw and bring these things back. And it really fuels the European desire to classify, to systemize, and to try and understand the natural world. And so this is coinciding with the Enlightenment movement. And again, it's hard to say just how much of it is this is feeding the Enlightenment or the Enlightenment is feeding that. I think it's probably a recursive process where these things are combined together. We talked about how experimenting, observation, trying new things, conducting experiments, basically. And they mention here on 523 how James Cook, Captain Cook, he was able to keep his men from getting scurvy, which would decimate your crew. And it's a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. Well, he would force them to eat citrus fruits and sauerkraut to keep them from getting scurvy. Even though, quote, he did not know exactly why this worked. He was, in this sense, an Enlightenment figure interested in all aspects of the world around him, open to new, empirically demonstrated tools and techniques. So, yes, very, very interesting, right? I noticed that the Frankfurter who I have on my crew doesn't. I don't know why a Frankfurter's on his crew. They aren't known for being seamen, but I noticed this fellow eats a lot of sauerkraut and he didn't get scurvy, and so you just try it. The finding of these new cultures, and the reason I say that it's hard to know how much of this fed the Enlightenment, how much the Enlightenment fed this, it's very true that someone like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which those of you who took Western political thought with me know this, he was very influenced by these travel books that came back, especially these ones that were written by Bougainville, who depicted the people of Tahiti that they encountered as, quote, noble savages, uncorrupted by civilization, living in this kind of Edenic paradise, which in turn informed Rousseau's own idea of civilization as a corruption of the pure individual. And this, of course, would be something that was repeated and re-examined throughout the Enlightenment, and is also visible in more modern things like, modern, I guess, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, if you're familiar with that kind of conflict. Well, Brave New World's a good book if you haven't read it. Trade in the Indian Ocean. 525, mentioning the Joint Stock Company, the VOC, the United East India Company. I mentioned this in the last lecture about, look, I mean, some of these paid well, some of them didn't. The South Sea Company didn't. It was a crapshoot, but it was one of the only ways that you could really get rich, or at least generate a good income. I don't want to over exaggerate how rich you could get. Some people did get wildly rich from this stuff, but in 1526, there's this incredible map showing colonial possessions by the different powers. And you'll note that you have the Portuguese with all their little outposts along the Indian Ocean. You have the sprawling Spanish possessions. And then you'll note that England has basically nothing, just a few small little holdings in North America. And, this is 1648, which you all know what happened in 1648. So within a century, Britain is really going to be on the make here. The triumph of commons, the triumph of the gentry, basically commandeering the English state and using it to carry out policies that were going to expand its trade empire. This is what's going to be happening here. Going ahead. They talk a decent bit about 1783. Yes, in 1783 here you can see the vast transformation that has occurred, and you have to remember here that Great Britain had only just lost those pesky 13 American colonies there. So 544 is where that second map is. So you have the first map on 526, the second one on 544, just so you can kind of flip and just kind of visually see, oh wow, what's happening here, and this incredible expansion that takes place in English power here. In between, they talk a little bit about the French American Empire, and I'm not going to go too much. They go on for several pages about it, but we spoke about this as well. One of the reasons that the French had an easier time making Amerindian allies, is because of the way their settlement pattern was different. These English colonists who were coming and setting up farms, making families, producing more of their population, right? There's going to be 1 million British Americans around the time of the American Civil War. They're expanding, they're putting up fences, they're building huge towns, they're changing things, and they're obviously there to stay. Whereas, the French who are coming, like, they're individual traders, they're setting up a small military outpost here and there, they're marrying indigenous women, speaking the language, engaging in trade. They're not really... They are, to some extent, shaping and being shaped by them. It's more of a give and take, whereas the British Americans are viewed as much more of a threat. Their settlement pattern is much more of a threat to the Amerindians. The 7 Years' War, the War of American Independence, I'm really not going to go into those because we talked about those in Chapter 9. And I know as Americans we are used to thinking of American history as being the driver of all history. But I'm really not going to say much more about the United States except in passing, in the context of the French Revolution. Gosh. For a while. I'm going to mention them maybe periodically, but really not much, because this class ends with 1914. It ends with 1914. And what we're really concerned with towards the end of the class, we will have a lecture talking about the new industrial economy, which of course the United States will be a huge part of. By the time of the outbreak of the First World War, the Great War, as it was so called, the United States has the world's largest economy. So of course I have to talk about the transformation of the world economy and the industrial economy and how the United States fit into that. But politically and geopolitically, they're a marginal player. I will talk about them a little bit, but not much. So, but of course, you can always take one of Dr. Edwards' classes if you want to hear more about that. So, just kind of sum this up, in the 16th century, French and English monarchs had sponsored a few expeditions of discovery along the coast of North America, and their captains claimed these lands for France and England. All attempts at establishing permanent colonies had ended in failure, however, so that in 1600 the only significant European colonies outside Europe were those of Spain and Portugal. In the 17th century, however, the English and French pushed further into North America, establishing successful permanent settler colonies. Dutch independence from Spain was recognized. Remember, one of the outcomes of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And the Dutch established some colonies and trading centers in North America. All those Knickerbockers in New York. I had a good friend, a Knickerbocker, whose family came to New York around that time. Private companies were established in England and the Netherlands to support these ventures, providing financial backing, ships, and personnel. Merchants are forming very dense networks and circulating goods and information. Explorers gathering scientific information. New crops, plantations. Other European powers are increasingly contesting Spanish dominance and establishing colonies, where enslaved African Americans are producing sugar and other crops on large plantations. So, the development of these colonies had a powerful economic impact and drove a lot of competition between these states. They wanted to secure access to these. In large part, this was because, in the event of a war, your access to these things could be cut off. Now, I don't want to over-exaggerate the importance of these things. What did we say they were bringing in? Was it all the food they were going to eat? No. They were consumer goods, right? It's things like sugar. You can live without sugar. Spices. You can live without spices. This is one of the reasons that some economic historians have cast doubt on the idea that even if Napoleon could have done a better job with his continental system, so-called, blockading trade with English ships and from English colonies, etc., that this would have been able to win the war, just because so much of the economic life of people during this period is still intensely local. Yes, we are in a period of globalization during this period. Absolutely. I mean, you have goods from the other side of the world coming and being planted in other soil, and you just have this incredible interchange. Absolutely. It's globalization, but it's not globalization to the extent that we think about it today. Nowhere close to that. So, that being said, look, obviously anything from these chapters is fair game as far as quiz or exam questions. You will want to be doing these readings to have a fuller, more comprehensive picture of the world and what is going on here. Especially these chapters where it's talking about the rest of the world and how Europe is interacting with the rest of the world. Because, of course, this class is about the making of the modern world. And so it tends to be increasingly Eurocentric because the Europeans are increasingly dominating large portions of the globe. And so I needed to explain how it was they came to be doing that. The sophisticated financial and monetary systems that they came up with to do this, the sophisticated social innovations, the institutions, things like joint stock companies, things like the very professional armies that they fielded, who used very professional tactics. That were, and this is something that, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the context of the English Civil War, the New Model Army, that the ability to have soldiers who just wanted to fight and were professional and drilled in how to move and turn and fire in order. Like, look, when bullets are flying and people are screaming and cannons are going off and stuff, it's easy to understand how, some forced peasant conscript who doesn't really want to be there is going to totally freak out and lose his head and run away or drop his gun or not be doing what he's supposed to be doing. And just imagine that happening on a very large scale. If you have a very tightly disciplined professional force that are able to move as a unit and execute these maneuvers under fire, this is going to be a huge advantage. And this is something that the European armies are going to bring to the fore. So it's not just that they also have, the technology. We've seen that gunpowder weapons are all over Eurasia at this point. So a few words on the situation that we're going to explode on Wednesday, that being the situation in France. I want to draw your attention back, if I could, to the English Civil War, the English Revolution, so-called, the period. Who was the clash between? Just try and recall. Who increasingly had the economic power of the nation, but did not exercise what they felt was their due political control? It was the gentry class. It was that upper middle class of traders, of merchants, of manufacturers, of landowners who were methodically exploiting their land and managing it in a business-like way. They were rapidly accruing wealth. And we talked about how this class was really trying to assert control over the direction of governmental policy because they dominated the House of Commons. And parliamentary supremacy is one of the outcomes, arguably the key outcome, of the period of the English Civil War / English Revolution / Glorious Revolution. So, as I read you a couple of passages here, I want that to be first and foremost in your mind. Because, of course, the English gentry class, there were a lot of peculiarities to the English system, right? You had the House of Commons, number one. You had this thing called Parliament that the king had to call to raise his taxes, and there was this thing called the Commons, and it was an important part of the taxing procedure, and you had these middle class guys, essentially these upper middle class guys who were increasingly dominating it. That's not the case in France. The French kings go over a century without even calling what we call the Estates Generale. This was the three corporate bodies, and this again is it's so interesting because France, as we're going to see, is still very medieval in its politics. These estates vote not as individuals but as corporate bodies, and the offices of profit under the crown, these are the offices of profit that we talked about, these are going to be dominated by the nobility. They're trying to hold on to their privileges to not be taxed. It's a feudal reaction. Against Louis XVI's rather wise ministers like the great Turgot, who are trying to make reforms to save the regime, essentially saying, sire, we are in the modern period now. We're almost to the year 1800, and our economy and politics are still quite medieval. We really need to make some updates here. We need to, get rid of the guilds and rationalize. We need to rationalize things. We need to have more freedom, more trade, internal and external. And so I'm going to read you a couple of passages here. And this is from your reading for next week. So these are just some things that I want you to be thinking about. Oh, this is for later. I'm going to end with that one. Sorry. Sorry, I'm one of those people who underlines and circles too many things. So then it can be very difficult to see what it was I wanted to. Okay. The feudal reaction is what provides the spark to explode the powder keg in France. What do we mean here? The 400 or so persons who, among the 23 million Frenchmen, formed the nobility, they enjoyed considerable privileges, exemption from several taxes, the right to receive feudal dues. Politically, their situation is not brilliant. Absolute monarchy, which the Bourbon kings practiced, while entirely aristocratic and feudal in its ethos, had deprived the nobles of political independence and responsibility and cut down their old representative institutions, the estates and parlements, so far as possible. The fact continued to rankle among the higher aristocracy and among the more recent nobles de robe, created by the king for various purposes. These were the people who had been ennobled to carry out duties for the king in things like finance and administration. An ennobled government class which expressed the double discontent of aristocrats and bourgeois, the bourgeois being the sort of upper middle class. Economically, the nobles' worries were by no means negligible. Remember, they were fighters. They weren't earners. They looked down on petty things like working or even managing their own estate to make it more economical. Remember we said things just kind of carried on the way they had always carried on. They largely relied on wealthy marriages. You know, you've got this bourgeois class. They have the money, but they don't have political power. So if I'm a very wealthy merchant or banker, what I might do is go to a noble, one of the great noble families, and say, listen, I know that you are stretched for money, but you have a daughter or a son or whatever the case may be, daughter, son, whatever. I will marry my son or daughter into your family in exchange for a large infusion of cash. And now I'm basically joining my family, my descendants are joining the noble ranks, and they're, you know, receiving the money that they need to stay economically viable and relevant. The expenses of noble status were large and rising. Of course, inflation was reducing the value of their fixed revenues, such as rents. And it was therefore natural that nobles would use their one main asset, the acknowledged privileges of their noble order, to try to maintain themselves. And throughout the 18th century in France and many other countries, they started to encroach upon the official posts, which the absolute monarchy had preferred to fill with the technically competent and politically harmless middle-class men, right? So, by the 1780s, they're making rules. They're making rules. And by the 1780s, you needed to be noble to buy a commission in the army. All bishops were nobles. The intendancies need to be noble. These were basically all the plush positions in the government. They're capturing them, exasperating the middle class. Also, super annoying, especially among the poorer nobles, they're attempting to counteract the decline in their income by squeezing the most out of their every considerable feudal right from the peasantry. And there was a whole profession called the feudus, and they would basically dig through the old feudal records and look for fees that the lord could collect that, you know, maybe they hadn't been collected in centuries, but legally, technically, they had a claim to them. I see I'm nearing an hour, so I will wrap this up. So you can see that the peasants who are being squeezed, they're going to be furious about the situation. There's also going to be some bad harvests that occur right around the time this political crisis is going to explode in the 1780s. It's going to coincide with that. You also have the middle class who are furious about this. And then you have the nobles who want to secure their privileges from the king, who is going to call an assembly to try and raise some money, because the French government did not have a sophisticated financial apparatus. We talked about how they did not have a sophisticated monetary or fiscal apparatus at this time, and how they'd been fighting war, and financing war, and were out of money. And the government's crisis gave the aristocracy and their parliaments their chance. So when the king calls one of them finally and says, look, I've got to have some new tax money, pony up, you're my guys, of course you're going to help me. They say, not without some concessions. It starts to look very adversarial, much like those late 16 teens, early 1620s confrontations between the Stuart kings and the commons. Trouble is brewing here. Now, I just want to say one final thing here, because I think this is instructive. I had mentioned Turgot. There is a conflict here between the rising middle classes, who feel like the people who are involved in trade, in commerce, in banking, they want more of a say in government, and they're completely shut out. But they're paying a large portion of the taxes, and they're being completely shut out. The conflict between the official framework and the vested interests of the old regime and the rising new social forces was more acute in France than elsewhere, and the new forces knew precisely what they wanted. Turgot, the physiocrat economist, stood for an efficient exploitation of the land. Efficient. Remember, we talked about efficiency. For free enterprise and trade. Remember, the ability to just freely enter a trade, no more guilds. For a standardized, efficient administration, no more local taxes and all these different regulations. And a single homogeneous national territory. None of this, you speak that language and I walk across the bridge and now you speak another language and I walk across another bridge and you speak another language, and, just makes it impossible to administer this stuff. And what's with all these different holdings in all these different places? Remember the territory of Prussia that I showed you, where it's like little splotches here and there. It's a very unnatural shape. Turgot, between 1774 and 1776, is going to fight to try to implement these changes, and he's going to be defeated. They fail lamentably. Because of opposition to those whose privileges they were threatening. Reforms of this character in modest doses were not incompatible with or unwelcome to absolute monarchies. On the contrary, since they tended to strengthen their hand, they were, as we have seen, widely propagated at this time among the so-called enlightened despots, people like Catherine and Frederick. But in most of the countries of enlightened despotism, such reforms were either inapplicable, and therefore mere theoretical flourishes, as in Russia, or unlikely to change the general character of their political and social structure, as in Prussia. Or else they failed in the face of the resistance of the local aristocracies and other vested interests, France, leaving the country to relapse into a somewhat tidied up version of its former self. And in France they failed more rapidly than elsewhere, for the resistance of the vested interests was more effective. But the results of this failure were more catastrophic for the monarchy, and the forces of bourgeois change were far too strong to relapse into inactivity. They merely transformed their hopes from an enlightened monarchy to the people or the nation. So, that is where we are headed. The French Revolution. We will talk about this on Wednesday. I look forward to seeing you there.